Hi everyone, this is Sam here, a current college student at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Welcome to my podcast, College Conscience, where we talk about the good, the bad, and everything in between with the college experience. With each episode, I focus on a different topic pertaining to college life with a different friend, and I really want to hear their perspectives and see what advice they have for me and anyone who might listen about that specific topic. Some examples include health and wellness, academics, professional career, exploration, and even more. So if you're interested in any of those topics, please stick around and hear what my friends have to say. Hey Viha, thanks so much for being on my podcast on this great afternoon. Would you like to say anything about yourself and the topic we're going to talk about?
Sure. Hey, Sam. So my name is Viha. I'm a junior here at Georgetown with Sam. I'm from Dallas, Texas, and today I guess we'll be talking about cooking specifically in college and some of our own personal experiences with cooking, which I'm super excited about.
Yeah, and I think just for context, like at Georgetown, usually your first 2 years you're in certain dorms where the kitchen isn't in your room, like it's a common floor kitchen. So we can cook as underclassmen, but it's definitely a bit harder. There's like a bigger barrier. So now that we're juniors, we're able to have our own apartments and our own kitchens. So with that context, I'm curious, like going into this year, when you knew you had this apartment, like how did you start preparing for potentially cooking a lot or even just cooking a few times? Like what thoughts went into your head for that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think for context, in our sophomore dorms, we had like microwaves,
Right.
and that was kind of the extent to which I utilized like just like cooking utensils, just because our common room kitchen was always just like an absolute mess. And so I made a lot of like Indian style ramen, and that was really nice sometimes. But no, I was super excited to come into junior year with a kitchen, especially like sharing a kitchen with other people would be really interesting. But yeah, I think the first thing I did was ask my mom, like, what are essentials and what are easy college recipes that I can make? And then how do I tailor what I use in my kitchen to those recipes? So she was like, oh my God, you should get like a mini Instapot, because you can just throw things in there, leave, go study, do whatever, come back, and then things are just like cooked for you. And so I got one, and I've only really used it like a couple of times, really just as like a rice cooker. I think living in college made me realize that I like the active act of cooking and like monitoring food while it's being cooked and like standing over a stove, which is interesting. But yeah, I got like cutting boards, knives, a few pots and pans, utensils, bowls, plates, cups, every kitchen staple. But it was really funny because we just went to IKEA, balled out, just bought so much stuff. And by the time I came, just because Dallas to DC, you can't drive easily.
Right.
And so I flew here, and one suitcase was full of like clothes, and then the other one was just full of like cooking utensils. So I opened it and then got all our stuff out. But yeah, I think my first step was talking to my mom about like what do you wish you had in your first kitchen, and like what did you have and what worked and what didn't. So
Right. No,
yeah.
for sure. And you touched on a point about like being excited to cook with others. I'm curious, like what thoughts you had going into it with like how you thought that dynamic would happen, because obviously like these are your friends that you're living with, but you haven't lived in this kind of situation with them, especially like with the kitchen in mind. So I'm curious, like, did you guys talk a lot about like cooking together beforehand, or just like what kind of dynamic is it to cook not just like for yourself or with yourself, but with other people there as well?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I guess like a couple of points. So I'm the only vegetarian in my household, and so that was something that I really wanted to keep in mind. Also, just with like cultural practices in India and like the region and religion that I'm from, there's kind of a stigma against cross-contamination with meat. And
Got
so like that's really interesting, because I find that in some slightly, I guess, more typical college dorms that are apartment style, there'll be like one or two sets of like pots and pans, and people just use whatever. But I wanted to share my things with my roommates because I love them, but I also just wanted them to be mindful of this cross-contamination sort of like thing that I had. So like I have a separate stack of plates that I use and a separate like drawer that I keep everything in, and a separate like cabinet, but they can use anything they want as long as the food is vegetarian. So we even have like 2 sponges. One is for vegetarian dishes and then one is like for dishes that have meat on them. And so I think that that's kind of one thing that I had to keep in mind, but my roommates have been so incredibly lovely in like respecting that and also asking me what my personal boundaries were with that. Also, what I've realized is that I'm shit at cooking for just one person, because like how I learned to cook wasn't necessarily through like experimenting by myself or like trying new recipes on my own. It was more like my mom and dad teaching me how to cook. So their proportions are for 3 people because I'm an only child and it was both of my parents, so 3 of us in one household. So typically whenever I cook things, like I will always consistently have leftovers, and whoever's in the house just eats, or whoever's like in the kitchen studying just eats. And so I don't think we ever formally talked about like cooking together. I think at the beginning of the semester people are always more ambitious than they are in practice, which is like everything. But we thought like every Thursday or Friday we'd sit, someone would cook, and we'd have like a nice roomy meal together, and we did that for a couple of weeks and it was fun. But now it's just a lot more casual as opposed to scheduled. But I know whenever you lived in DC in an apartment freshman year, you cooked a lot. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I remember we were on like a call for this club we're both in, just like chatting, and I was considering like potentially visiting DC if vaccines got out fast enough. Unfortunately, I couldn't do it that semester. But you were like, oh my God, you have to come over. I have to cook you something. And I was like, oh, that's so impressive. He can cook. I want to be his friend. Which is so funny.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that feels like so long ago. I did live in an apartment in Roslyn my freshman spring. So that was spring of 2021, which is more than a year ago now. And I don't know if like we could call it cooking. Maybe it was like making sure things were edible before putting them into my mouth. But yeah, I think cooking definitely is different when you're like on your own. And for more context, like both me and Viha are living off campus, or plan to live off campus next year, and that will definitely make cooking more of like a real thing as opposed to right now where we still have to be on the meal plan, but we also have an opportunity to cook.
Yeah.
And I think like it really just depends on how much passion you have for it. Like I have a lot of friends who are really talented at cooking, but when I was in Roslyn, I approached it more as like a basic need.
Yeah.
And I have people on both sides of that. And I think when it comes down to that, it's just about like making sure you know the things you can cook well, and every now and then like experimenting. Like I always could cook like certain meats well, like eggs, certain vegetables. Like I eventually really liked making Brussels sprouts in the oven, for example, and then always having rice was a very nice grain and also just like a stabilizer for any meal I had.
Definitely.
And I think just like getting those basic needs down really helped me when I was cooking. And that's kind of what I wanted to ask you next. When you cook right now, what are like the essential ingredients, especially for like college students? Like what do you think are essential foods or even just like spices that people should have because you just use it so often? I'm just curious like what you personally have found to be essential.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting. So I think that like my household is pretty multicultural, and we also like experimenting with new cuisines. So I'll always open a cabinet and there will be like something new that someone has picked up from a different store, just to experiment with that week. So that's always fun, like just getting to experiment. But in terms of staples, I didn't realize the amount of eggs I would go through until I came to college, because my breakfast back home, especially during online school, was just like an omelet or like a bagel with egg and cheese on top, and I didn't realize that like that is what I cooked the most at home. So now while I'm at Georgetown, that is of course what I also cook the most. So definitely like butter, eggs, and cheese, just like a good source of protein. In addition to that, pasta is probably the easiest meal that you can make, so I have that at all times. I've been trying to experiment with like Trader Joe's ingredients and meals, because there isn't a Trader Joe's near my house where I grew up, so every time I go I'm like, oh, this is new, I should pick this up. I use bread a lot for different sandwiches as well. In terms of spices, our spice cabinet is stacked. There's so much. My mom sent me to college with a shoebox full of just like different plastic bags of spices because one of my aunts back home like has her own spice making business. So she just gave me a ton for free, and so I brought all that. So there's like garam masala, just different types of masala powders for different recipes, chili powder, obviously like salt, pepper, dried basil, dried oregano, things like that. Yeah, but I realized that no matter what I cook, I always try to put in different spices or experiment with different spice combinations, and that can really make or break a dish. I think tomorrow I'm gonna make eggs with like za'atar on.
I love that.
Za'atar eggs. So we'll see how that goes. What about you? What are your kitchen like staples? Rice. We already talked about that. Same for me. Same for me.
I actually like wasn't on the spice life for a while, and both based off like my background but also personal taste, but I've started like experimenting more with it. And so definitely like have been using the basic ones more like sriracha. I have like the chili flakes is ready to go.
Yes.
And I want to like keep experimenting, so maybe I'll like come over and figure something out.
Yes.
And one last question on this portion. I was curious, like, and this is again very Georgetown specific, but you mentioned like Trader Joe's. I assume like Safeway is also up there, but how often are you able to make it out there? Because like we do live a good mile away, I want to say. So like, how have you found actually getting the groceries like to your house, that experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what I have sometimes had to do is just walk there with like a group of 3 or 4 people. Typically my roommates are like friends, and then Uber back. But it always sucks because you have to carry the groceries all the way back to like your dorm, and I'm sure you've experienced that as well. And that also like gets more expensive Ubering, obviously, but then when you split the price, it turns out to only be a couple of dollars, which isn't too bad for like good fresh groceries. But my roommate actually is from the DC area. She's like 4 or 5 miles out. So she works a job in Georgetown, and so she'll drive her car over and like on the days when she works. And then either before or after her work, I, and our other roommates will just go in her car and then use the free parking beneath Trader Joe's to get groceries and take them back directly to ours, which is really nice. And so that's been really, really lovely. Actually, one time we walked to Trader Joe's, got stuff, and we exited intending to make like a quick Safeway trip as well, but we walked out and then magically all of a sudden this Guts bus appears. And for context, Guts is Georgetown University Transportation Services System? Services?
Something like that.
Something like that. Or shuttle, you're right.
Yeah.
And so basically it takes you from campus or like locations around campus to various spots in DC, so like Roslyn, DuPont, the Law Center, which is in downtown. And a Guts bus just appeared, and we were like, oh my god. And so we all like hopped on with our armloads full of groceries, and I don't think a single college student was on that bus. It was all like working professionals, which is so interesting. And then so we just rode the Guts bus, which took an extra 10 minutes because there were a couple more stops, and then it just let us out by the back of campus. And then we had to lug all our groceries up, but it was cheaper than paying for an Uber, so we really didn't mind it.
For sure.
But yeah, what about you? What do you normally do? Is it like a hike for you as well? Yeah.
It is pretty inconvenient because like the way there to both Trader Joe's and Safeway is all uphill.
Yeah.
Like, just up Wisconsin. So I don't go as much anymore because going off the point of like you saying that everyone's more ambitious at the beginning of the semester, that's definitely true. So I go when I can, but I think I'm just mindful that like it's a good thing that cooking isn't like a priority right now, or like it's not necessary, so I don't have to do it as much. Like I do it when I want to, but because we're like on the meal plan, it's not something that I actively pursue as much as like next year, for example. So that definitely takes like the pressure off to make the hike, but I also really enjoy cooking.
Yeah.
So it's a balance. And yeah, that Guts shuttle, it's just because it's between like the med school and more areas north of Georgetown, so that's probably why college students, I don't think a lot of them even know it exists.
Exactly.
But yeah, no, I'm really glad you found that. It's like, it's a cute little route that it does as well. Viha has definitely made a lot of already amazing dishes this semester, but now let's talk about one specific instance where earlier this year she made one of her recipes passed down from her mother.
Yeah, so one day a couple of weeks into the semester, I was really, really craving South Indian food, and I wanted to do something nice for my roommates. I wanted to cook for them, and so I called up my mom. I asked her like what the ingredients were for the specific recipe called chana, or like chole in some parts of India. I'm not actually sure if it's 100% South Indian, but we eat it in my house, so it's automatically South Indian because of that. But I called her up. I asked her for the recipe. Went, sourced all the ingredients. Long hike there and back. And then I started cooking for my roommates. And it's really funny because the recipe my mom gave me was like, oh, like a pinch of this type of masala, or like, you know, just like a handful of this other ingredient. And so it's, I think, really hard to be precise with like recipes like that. So that's really funny. I think that's where like your own personal like flavor palette comes in, and like experimentation, which is always really fun and interesting. And so anyways, I was cooking for my roommates, and what was really nice is throughout this experience, like the house just started smelling like my own house, which I just thought was really nice and like comforting. And so the recipe is essentially garbanzo beans that are like soaked in different spices for a really long time, with like some tomatoes in there, and it's normally served over a bed of rice. So I made rice, I made chana or chole, and I had put all of these ingredients in a crock pot, and I just left it to simmer for 30 minutes. And then I came back and I opened up the crock pot, and the consistency was just like a little bit different from what my mom like makes at home. And later I called her up and told her this, and she was like, yeah, you're supposed to like mash down the beans, so it's like it just has a different consistency. And so I was like, okay. And then we tried it, and I'd done everything like perfectly to a T, like with all the right measurements and things like that, the best pinches I could get, and it just did not taste as like good as I expected it to, or as like maybe not as like comforting as I expected it to. And so I was thinking about it more, and I think it's such a testament to like take a family recipe and perfect it as much as possible to like everyone's taste and liking. And in my family historically, like although like my dad really likes cooking, I have some uncles that are actually like chefs, like they work in restaurants for a living. It's typically been the women that have like cooked at home, and I've realized that my mother and grandmothers and great grandmothers have had like decades to perfect certain recipes and get them to like the point of perfection that they are now. And although that's the end goal for me, of course, I know it'll take a while to get there, and so reckoning with that was really interesting. But yeah, it also made me realize, back on the topic of like home foods being comforting, that whenever I was younger, like elementary, middle school, high school, I took those types of recipes for granted all the time. Like my mom would be like, oh, like Viha, like what do you want for dinner tonight? It's a Friday, so I can either cook us something or we can go get like takeout, like pizza or something. And I'd always choose like the takeout option because that was something just like relatively newer. And now, like looking back on that, I realize the value of home cooked food, because this recipe that took me like an hour and a half to make, that my mom said would take 10 minutes, took her like 5. You know what I mean? And so I don't know, I think like efficiency and speed that comes with experience is really valuable, but also like women taking the time, care, effort, and energy to perfect recipes is also like something that should not be pushed to the side. But yeah, I guess that's one story of me cooking something, it not going like perfectly, and then me like reflecting upon that experience and taking something away from it. But yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Wow, what an amazing story. Now let's talk a bit more about how cooking connects to family, and how Via feels like her relationship with her mom and family have improved ever since she started cooking more. More opportunity to cook, especially this year, has brought you and your mom closer. And I'm sure, like, at a baseline, the answer is yes, because like, you guys talk more, like, she's able to share more with you. But I'm curious, like, on the more nuanced sides, like, have you seen any, like, small changes on how you cooking has brought you two closer?
That's a really interesting question, because you're 100% right. Like, it has, we talk more, I ask her for advice more and things like that. But also, I think it's really interesting because after living in like this type of college style apartment for about a month, I went home for my dad's birthday and we decided to cook something together. And I think that like whenever I was at home, I would offer help, like in high school, by the way of like cutting up vegetables or like stirring something over the stove, which are important tasks, but more like sous chef tasks, you know what I mean? Did you ever like cut vegetables for your parents while they were cooking? It's like, yeah, okay, sure. But it's like sometimes it doesn't feel like cooking, if that makes sense. But this time I was taking like a more active role in the kitchen, and I would tell her to like sit down, like I'll finish the recipe or I'll season it and make sure it tastes good. Like I'll stand over the stove and make sure that the consistency is correct, things like that. And so I think that what brings people closer together is acts of service for one another. Like I think that like that's something that's important to both me and my mom. And so like I think that by practicing cooking more, I can just do more acts of service for her whenever we're together, because she spent my whole life cooking for me, and I think she deserves like repayment in some way. Not that cooking is transactional by any means. I think it comes purely from love, but I can just love her in a different way now, and I think that's made us closer. But such a great question.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think cooking is also like so much work at the beginning, and it's like really underestimated by a lot of college students in particular, including myself. Like when I first made the plans to go to Roslyn and everything, I was like, oh, like cooking will just be like a necessary thing, but it's every day. It's not necessarily like the physical actions you're taking, but it's like the mentality of like, okay, after a long day of like working or classes or whatever, like now I have to like probably spend a good 30 minutes to an hour like preparing something and then satisfying myself.
And it's also tough to decide like what to eat, I've realized, because you have to take into account like what your preferences are, and sometimes I have no preferences. I just know I have to eat to exist. And then also like what's in the pantry right now, like what can I eat feasibly. And so like it's interesting because sometimes I'm sure you felt this too, but like I'm in the mood to cook, and then sometimes I'm just like I don't want to cook, but I kind of have to because like the menu at our dining hall is just like bad or like not vegetarian friendly or like things like that. Subjectively bad. Yeah. No, I agree. But no, that's so interesting. So how often do you cook, just out of curiosity? Because I know we're both on the meal plan, but I've found myself cooking more than I expected myself to.
Interesting. I definitely cooked more at the beginning of the year. I would say like a couple times a week. And now I primarily cooked breakfast back then because like the way our meal plan is, like we just get, if you divide it up on the entire week, like we would use the main dining hall like 2 times a day. Yeah. So that leaves like 1 meal for you to potentially cook. And now I think I actually save it more for like late nights. If I just, well, for me late nights is like 10 p.m. but that's another topic. But like late nights and just like wanting to cook some dumplings or maybe something a bit more simpler like congee. And I think I definitely gravitate more towards like comfort food because it's like really easy to equate cooking those kinds of foods with like home and kind of like your parents and when you were growing up, you know?
No, I completely agree. That makes sense. I think I found myself cooking like 4 to 5 times a week, which isn't that bad. And then I try to do more like ambitious or like new recipes on weekends. Like the other weekend I made mushroom risotto for myself and my housemates, and that was super fun, but it took so long, but it's really fun.
It's always the time.
It's always the time.
You really gotta set aside time, and in college I feel like you're always prioritizing things, and it's just a matter of like if you want to prioritize cooking to like that degree. I think it's different for everyone. Yeah. But definitely very commendable to be trying the ambitious recipes. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Viha, for being on my podcast, and I'm sure people who listen to this will learn a bit more about cooking and what it could potentially mean to their families as well. So yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Sam. This was so much fun.
Yes. Thank you so much for checking out that episode of College Conscience with my guest. If you want to see or hear more episodes, go visit College Conscience on Spotify, where I'll upload new episodes every Monday and Thursday. Thanks for listening.